On December 8th, 2011, the NBA made a decision that lasted about 30 seconds. A trade was announced, then canceled. And at the time, most people thought it was ridiculous. Fans were angry, players were furious, analysts could not believe it. But nobody realized something else, because over the next 15 years, that one canceled trade would change the fate of Kobe Bryant, create Lob City, help James Harden become a superstar, change the future of the Oklahoma City Thunder, and indirectly contribute to one of the greatest dynasties in NBA history. This is the story of the biggest butterfly effect in NBA history. And it all started with Chris Paul. In the summer of 2011, the NBA found itself in a strange position. The league had just emerged from a lockout. Teams were scrambling to reshape their rosters. Free agency was chaos. And sitting in New Orleans was one of the best point guards in basketball. A true point guard, Chris Paul. At just 26 years old, Paul was already a four-time All-Star. One of the smartest players in the league, one of the best passers the game had ever seen, and most importantly, he wanted out. The Hornets were not contenders. Paul's contract was running down, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time before he was traded. What nobody expected was where he was going. On December 8th, 2011, reports began flooding across the NBA. Chris Paul was headed to the Los Angeles Lakers. Just like that, the deal looked done. The framework had been agreed to. The NBA had been informed. Players had been notified. The future had arrived. For the Lakers, it was the perfect move. Kobe Bryant was 33 years old. He was still one of the best players in basketball, but his championship window was beginning to close. The Lakers needed another superstar, someone who could eventually carry the franchise into the future. Chris Paul was that player. He was not just an all-star. He was arguably the best point guard in basketball. The idea of pairing Kobe Bryant with Chris Paul immediately terrified the rest of the league. Imagine trying to defend that. Kobe attacking from the wing, Chris Paul controlling every possession, one of the greatest scorers ever, paired with one of the greatest playmakers ever. It felt unfair. And for Lakers fans, it felt inevitable. The franchise had done this before. When Magic Johnson retired, they found Shaquille O'Neal. When Shaq left, they still had Kobe. When Kobe aged, they would have Chris Paul. It felt like another chapter in the Lakers' endless story of superstar succession. Meanwhile, the rest of the trade made sense too. The Houston Rockets would receive Pau Gasol. The Hornets would receive a package of veterans and young assets. Every team got something. Nobody was thrilled, but everybody understood it. This is how the NBA worked. Stars got traded, contenders got stronger, the cycle continued. And then something happened that had never happened before. The NBA stepped in. To understand why, we need to go back a few months. Earlier that year, the NBA had purchased the New Orleans Hornets. The franchise was struggling financially. There was no owner, which meant something unusual. The league itself effectively controlled basketball operations. In theory, the Hornets still had a front office. In reality, the NBA had final authority. Most people didn't think much about this until the Chris Paul trade appeared. Suddenly, owners around the league began complaining. The backlash was immediate. Teams were furious. Executives questioned the deal. And according to reports, several owners voiced concerns directly to NBA Commissioner David Stern. The argument wasn't necessarily that the trade was unfair. It was that the league itself was helping the Lakers acquire another superstar, and for many owners, that was unacceptable. Then came the phone call. Just hours after the deal had been reported, just hours after players believed their futures had been decided, David Stern rejected the trade. Not modified, not delayed, rejected. The Chris Paul trade was dead. The reaction was chaos. Players couldn't believe it. Executives couldn't believe it. Fans definitely couldn't believe it. One moment Chris Paul was a Laker. The next moment he wasn't. Even today, more than a decade later, people still argue about whether the veto was justified. Some believe Stern protected competitive balance. Others believe the league interfered with a legitimate basketball decision. But regardless of which side you're on, everyone was asking the same question: why did the NBA kill the trade? And that's understandable because it was one of the most shocking decisions in league history, but it's also the wrong question. because the real story isn't why the trade was stopped. The real story is what happened because it was stopped. Because once Chris Paul wasn't a Laker, the future of the NBA changed completely. What happened next completely changed Los Angeles basketball. Not for one season, not for 5 seasons, for an entire generation. Because the NBA thought it had stopped a super team. What it actually did was create a completely different one. When the Chris Paul trade was vetoed, most people focused on what the Lakers had lost. A future Hall of Fame point guard, a superstar to pair with Kobe Bryant, perhaps the final championship window of the Kobe era. But nobody knew just how expensive that decision would become, because after losing Chris Paul, the Lakers panicked, and panic is rarely a good strategy. At first, there was optimism. The Lakers still had Kobe, they still had Pau Gasol, they were still one of the NBA's premier franchises. Surely another opportunity would emerge, and eventually one did. In 2012, the Lakers assembled what many believed was a super team. They traded for Dwight Howard, they acquired Steve Nash, and suddenly the roster looked ridiculous. Kobe Bryant, Steve Nash, Dwight Howard, Pau Gasol, 4 future Hall of Famers. On paper, it looked unstoppable. Many analysts picked them to win the championship. Some predicted they would dominate the Western Conference. Instead, they barely survived. Injuries piled up. Chemistry never developed. Dwight Howard never looked comfortable. Steve Nash struggled to stay healthy. And as the season spiraled, Kobe Bryant was forced to carry an impossible burden. Then came April 12, 2013. With the Lakers desperately fighting for a playoff spot, Kobe suffered one of the most devastating injuries in NBA history, a torn Achilles. Just like that, everything changed. The injury did not technically end Kobe's career, but it effectively ended his prime. He would never again be the same player. The Lakers would never again be true contenders during his tenure, and perhaps most importantly, the partnership that never happened suddenly looked even more tragic, because if Chris Paul had become a Laker, maybe things would have unfolded differently. Maybe Kobe would not have had to carry such a massive workload. Maybe the Lakers would have remained contenders. Maybe his final championship window would have stayed open. We will never know. But what we do know is that after the veto, the Lakers spent years chasing a future they thought they were supposed to have, and they never found it. The NBA thought it had stopped the Lakers from building another super team. Instead, it may have accelerated their decline. But while the Lakers were falling apart, something completely unexpected was happening across town. Just 4 days after the veto, Chris Paul was traded again, this time to the Los Angeles Clippers. At first glance, it looked like a consolation prize. The Clippers had spent decades being irrelevant for most of their existence. They were the punchline of the NBA. The Lakers owned Los Angeles. The Clippers simply existed there. Then Chris Paul arrived, and suddenly everything changed, because Paul wasn't joining an empty roster. Waiting for him was Blake Griffin, one of the most explosive athletes basketball had ever seen. Alongside him was DeAndre Jordan, a dominant lob threat who could finish anything near the rim. The fit was immediate. Chris Paul controlled the game. Blake Griffin destroyed rims. DeAndre Jordan finished everything else. The highlights were unbelievable. Alley-oops, fast breaks, poster dunks. Night after night, the Clippers became must-watch television. And before long, they had a nickname, Lob City. For the first time in franchise history, the Clippers mattered. National TV games increased, ticket demand exploded, celebrity fans filled courtside seats. A franchise that had spent decades in the shadows suddenly became one of the league's biggest attractions. And while they never reached the NBA Finals, their impact was enormous. For years, Los Angeles was no longer a one-team city. The Clippers had become legitimate contenders, something that would have sounded impossible just a few years earlier. And all of it traced back to one decision. If the Chris Paul trade isn't vetoed, Lob City never exists. The most iconic era in Clippers history never happens. An entire generation of basketball fans grows up watching something completely different. But as entertaining as Lob City was, it never accomplished its ultimate goal. No championships, no finals appearances, just years of playoff heartbreak. And that failure created another unexpected consequence, because while Chris Paul was building Lob City, another team was quietly searching for a star, a team that had originally been part of the vetoed trade, the Houston Rockets. And what they did next would eventually change the entire NBA. When the Chris Paul trade was vetoed, the Houston Rockets weren't supposed to be one of the main characters. In fact, they were barely part of the story at all. Most people remember the trade as a battle between the Lakers, the Hornets, and the NBA. But sitting quietly in the background was Houston. And what happened next would reshape the entire Western Conference. Because when the trade was vetoed, the Rockets lost something incredibly important. Paul Gasol, under the original deal, Houston would have acquired the 4-time All-Star and 2-time NBA champion. The Rockets believed he could become the centerpiece of their next era. Instead, the trade disappeared. No Chris Paul to the Lakers, no Paul Gasol to Houston. No future, just uncertainty. And uncertainty forced Houston to start looking elsewhere. At the time, the Rockets were stuck. Not bad enough to rebuild, not good enough to contend. A position NBA franchises know all too well. Then less than a year later, an opportunity emerged. In Oklahoma City, the Thunder faced a difficult decision. After reaching the NBA Finals in 2012, they had assembled one of the most talented young cores in league history. Kevin Durant, Russell Westbrook, Serge Ibaka, James Harden, 3 future MVP winners, 1 championship dream. Then came the contract negotiations. And as we know now, those negotiations didn't end well. The Thunder traded James Harden, and the team waiting to receive him, the Houston Rockets. The same Rockets who had spent the previous year searching for a star after missing out on Pau Gasol. The same Rockets who were suddenly desperate for a franchise cornerstone. And because they were desperate, they were willing to take a gamble that changed everything. At the time, James Harden wasn't James Harden. He was a 6th man of the year, a talented scorer, a future star, but nobody knew he would become one of the most dominant offensive players in NBA history. Houston believed, and within weeks, they looked like geniuses. In his very first game as a Rocket, Harden scored 37 points and recorded 12 assists. It was obvious almost immediately. This wasn't a role player. This wasn't a complimentary piece. This was a superstar waiting for an opportunity. Over the next decade, Harden transformed the Rockets. Multiple scoring titles, an MVP award, 8 straight playoff appearances, conference finals, runs, historic offensive numbers. For years, Houston became one of the NBA's most dangerous teams, and all of it traced back to a simple reality. If the Chris Paul trade had not been vetoed, the Rockets probably never would have become desperate enough to chase Harden. Maybe they build around Pau Gasol. Maybe they remain competitive. Maybe they never take the risk. And if they never trade for Harden, the next domino never falls. Because while Harden was becoming a superstar in Houston, something was quietly breaking in Oklahoma City. The Thunder had survived the trade. For a while, they remained contenders. Durant was still dominant. Westbrook was still elite. But the margin for error was gone, and eventually the cracks began to show. Injuries, playoff disappointments, missed opportunities. Then came 2016. The Thunder took a 3-1 lead over the 73-win Golden State Warriors, 1 win away from the NBA Finals. 1 win away from changing history. Then they lost 3 straight games. Weeks later, Kevin Durant left Oklahoma City, and where did he go? Golden State. Looking back, it's impossible not to wonder, would Durant have left if Harden was still there? Would the Thunder have won a championship? Would the Warriors have ever had the opportunity to sign him? We'll never know. But what we do know is that one canceled trade had now affected 4 franchises: the Lakers, the Clippers, the Rockets, the Thunder, and somehow the biggest consequence still hadn't happened. Because what if I told you the Chris Paul veto didn't just change a few teams? What if I told you it changed the balance of power across the entire NBA? Because from this point forward, the butterfly effect stops looking like a coincidence. It starts looking like a chain reaction that leads directly to one of the greatest dynasties basketball has ever seen. The Golden State Warriors. By 2016, the NBA had arrived at a crossroads. The Golden State Warriors had just completed the greatest regular season in league history. 73 wins, 9 losses. Stephen Curry had become the unanimous MVP, and yet somehow they were not champions after blowing a 3-1 lead in the NBA Finals against LeBron James and the Cavaliers. The Warriors suddenly faced an unusual problem. They were historically great, but not unbeatable. And that's when Kevin Durant became available today. Durant joining Golden State feels inevitable, like it was always going to happen. But that's only because we know how the story ends. At the time, there were dozens of possibilities. Durant could have stayed in Oklahoma City, joined Boston, gone to Washington, or returned to his hometown area. Nobody knew, not even Durant himself. But here's where things get interesting. Because if we're following the butterfly effect, we have to ask a difficult question. Why was Durant even available in the first place? The obvious answer is simple. The Thunder lost, but as we have already seen, that is not the whole story. Because years earlier, Oklahoma City had already weakened itself. Harden trade reduced the margin for error. The roster became more top-heavy, fragile, more dependent on Durant and Westbrook. And
While the Thunder made contenders, they never fully replaced what Harden provided. Eventually, those missing pieces mattered. The chain reaction had already begun. Chris Paul veto. Houston misses Bogazoo. Houston trades for Harden. Thunder lose Harden. Thunder become weaker. Durant leaves. And suddenly the Warriors are presented with an opportunity that might never have existed otherwise.
One phone call, one meeting, one decision, and basketball changes forever. Kevin Durant signs with Golden State. Immediately, the balance of power in the NBA shifts. The Warriors weren't just great anymore, they were overwhelming. Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, Draymond Green, Kevin Durant, 4 all-NBA talents on the same team. The league spent years trying to catch them. Most teams never came close. Over the next 3 seasons, Golden State reached 3 consecutive NBA Finals, won 2 championships, and built one of the most dominant dynasties basketball has ever seen. The Warriors changed how teams viewed roster construction, how stars viewed free agency, how front offices approached contention. The entire league adjusted, and all because one superstar became available at exactly the right moment. Now, does that mean the Chris Paul veto directly created the Warriors dynasty? Not exactly. Butterfly effects don't work that way. There isn't one clean line. There are dozens of smaller connections, choices, consequences, opportunities. But that's what makes this story so fascinating, because once you start following the chain reaction, you begin to notice just how many moments connect back to that original decision. The Lakers never become contenders again during Kobe's career. The Clippers experienced the most successful era in franchise history. James Harden becomes a superstar in Houston. The Thunder lose Kevin Durant. The Warriors become a dynasty. And all of it stems from one trade that never happened. At this point, it almost sounds ridiculous. Like we're connecting dots that shouldn't be connected, and maybe we are, but somehow the story still isn't over, because the strangest consequence of all isn't what happened to the Lakers or the Clippers or the Rockets or even the Warriors. It's what happened years later to the team that started this entire chain reaction, because 13 years after the veto, the Oklahoma City Thunder were back, and the path that led them there might be the craziest butterfly effect of all. By this point, the butterfly effect had already touched nearly every corner of the NBA. The Lakers lost the final superstar partnership of the Kobe era. The Clippers experienced the greatest stretch of success in franchise history. The Rockets found James Harden. The Thunder lost James Harden. Kevin Durant left Oklahoma City. The Warriors built a dynasty. Most stories would have ended there, but somehow the chain reaction kept going. Because after Durant left, Oklahoma City entered one of the most fascinating rebuilds in modern sports. For years, the Thunder searched for a way back. Russell Westbrook eventually left. Paul George eventually left. The dynasty was gone. The future looked uncertain. Then came another trade, one that felt insignificant at the time. When the Thunder traded Paul George to the Clippers in 2019, they received a package of draft picks and a young guard named Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. At the time, Shai was viewed as a promising prospect, a talented player, a future star perhaps. Nobody expected what happened next. Over the following years, Shai developed into one of the best players in basketball, an MVP candidate, a franchise cornerstone, the face of a new era. Meanwhile, the draft picks continued to accumulate. The Thunder drafted Chet Holmgren, Jalen Williams, built one of the deepest young rosters in the league, and slowly, quietly, Oklahoma City climbed back to the top. The same franchise that had lost Harden, the same franchise that had lost Durant, the same franchise that once looked like a cautionary tale had become a contender again. And that's where this story becomes truly bizarre, because if the Chris Paul trade isn't vetoed, maybe the Rockets never become desperate enough to pursue Harden. Maybe Harden never leaves Oklahoma City. Maybe Durant never leaves. Maybe the Warriors never become a dynasty. Maybe Paul George never gets traded. Maybe Shai never arrives in Oklahoma City. Maybe this version of the Thunder never exists. The butterfly effect had come full circle. The franchise that suffered one of the biggest consequences of the veto eventually became one of its biggest beneficiaries. And that's what makes the Chris Paul veto such a fascinating piece of NBA history. Because most people think basketball history is shaped by championships, game-winning shots, MVP seasons, historic performances, and sometimes that's true, but sometimes the biggest moments happen long before anyone realizes their importance. A phone call, a contract negotiation, a trade that never happens, moments so small they barely register at the time, yet years later they end up changing everything. The Chris Paul veto didn't create the Warriors dynasty. It didn't create Lob City. It didn't create James Harden. It didn't create the modern Thunder, but it helped create the conditions that made all of them possible. One decision, thousands of consequences, and that's what makes it the greatest butterfly effect in NBA history. Because the most important move wasn't the trade itself, it was the fact that it never happened. If you've watched this far, you've probably noticed something. Every major NBA story feels connected. The Lakers, the Clippers, the Rockets, the Thunder, the Warriors. What looked like separate stories were actually chapters of the same one. And chances are there are butterfly effects happening in the NBA right now that we won't fully understand for another decade. A trade, a draft pick, a free agent signing, a decision that seems small today, but eventually changes everything. The only question is, which one will it be? So let me know down in the comments, what do you think is the biggest butterfly effect in NBA history? The Chris Paul veto, the James Harden trade, Kevin Durant joining the Warriors, or something else entirely? I'd love to read your answers. And if you enjoyed this video and want more NBA documentaries, basketball rabbit holes, and stories that connect the history of the league in ways you never noticed before, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.